I know that you've made some general content on the quote unquote evidence-based fitness industry and whatnot. Again, I know you've had some specific like posts and everything on Milo. So what do you think is your biggest criticism? You can either make it specific to what like Milo Wolf is putting out, or maybe just in general, but some of the content you put out.
Okay, so my let's we'll start we'll start big in general and then get specific. So my issue with with the evidence based like philosophy, I guess. I hate saying philosophy; it sounds really like wishy washy. But my issue with being like evidence based in fitness is just that the evidence in a lot of cases, in my opinion, really sucks. My background for claiming that I was in experimental psychology in a master's program for a while, everything but thesis, before I kind of realized that that was a kind of a waste of my time, and took my life in a completely different direction. But in the process, I got a bunch of training in actual research methods, statistics, running experiments, all that good stuff. And I mean, every time I crack one of these studies, it's like they're failing to adhere to kind of the basic standards that another scientific field would actually adhere to. Like you're seeing studies with 11 subjects or something ridiculous like that. They're not double blinding the studies. It's apparently acceptable for someone to just say, oh yeah, no, we didn't double blind, just trust me, bro. I wouldn't, like, you have like a repeated measures test where you're putting the same group of people through two different conditions, and that's your how you're setting up the variable, and then you're not controlling for order effects. And all this is just kind of really basic stuff that you would just not be able to get published in I think any other field.
Yeah.
And this is actually getting published and treated as normal. And the excuse is just like, oh well, it's hard to get resources, so that's all we have. But okay, it's like you don't have the if you don't have the resources to do what you're trying to do, then I guess you don't get to do it, right? That would be my take. Like this stuff isn't designed such that you can necessarily trust the results you're getting, with what you're doing, right? Like now, I'm not trying to like say psychology is this big wonderful thing, and a lot of
Mhm.
like psychology has its issues. I was in my program at the time that the replication crisis hit.
Yeah.
That's probably has a lot to do with my cynicism. That was when,
Right.
for those who haven't heard about that, this fellow named Daryl Bim, a big shot in social psychology, I'd seen him in undergrad and in the textbooks, published a study on extrasensory perception. He's literally trying to publish data saying that people could predict the future, like literally. I'm not even making this up or like exaggerating or trying to be a contrarian. This is what happened. And he got it published in one of the most prestigious journals in that field, just based kind of on the power of his name because he was a big shot, right? And so a lot of people saw that and they're like, okay, this is a problem. Like, how did we get here? So we ended up trying to replicate a bunch of the studies in that field because like the propaganda on science that normies are sold is that, well, all these scientists are out here replicating each other's results, if anything doesn't hold up, well, other people are going to be fact checking that doesn't happen because there's no incentive for it. You have these people out here who are desperately trying to get a bunch of new findings published in prestigious journals so that they don't get fired after 7 years, because if you don't get enough journals or enough publications in prestigious journals, you don't get tenure. And what that means is you worked at your job for 7 years and now you're fired and you can't work. And not only are you fired from that job, you're probably going to have a hard time working in your chosen field ever again. And bottom line, there's no incentive for actually trying to replicate other people's research. You're trying to find your own novel findings. Bottom line, we found that a lot of stuff didn't replicate. And I totally understand why. I think in a lot of cases, people are just making up their data because they have to do that to just not to get fired, right? But at least on paper, they make everything look good, even if they completely fabricated their data set because it's what they had to do so that they could provide for their families. They at least made it look good on paper. But then you look at exercise science, and it's like, and in a lot of cases, it's like, come on, you're not meeting the bare minimum standards that you would need to meet to actually get published in another field. Why are we even using this? So
Right.
that's kind of my general. And that's not to say every study is that bad, but if you look at I mean, if you look at the list of actual good studies, it's not going to answer that many questions in fitness. And then you still have issues of like generalizability, like does this finding that we have, in a bunch of untrained people, and they always try to do shady stuff where they'll talk about like trained individuals, but then you find out the average bench press is like 165 pounds or something. Does this apply to advanced lifters? Does this apply here? It's just you don't get a lot of actual answers for
Yeah,
a lot
it's
of
definitely
questions.
tough. I mean, and to be fair to exercise science, I mean, for one, it obviously is impossible to double blind some of these studies, right? I mean, you can't have like a high volume and a low volume group and be like, hey, you're actually doing 50 sets if
Yeah.
you're doing five. So that, there's limitations there. And then of course, most of it's on college students. And I've helped run a couple of studies, and the my takeaway, unfortunately, was just like, wow, like this is not a now again, we're talking like two studies, but this is not a population that I would say, wow, like this is really going to apply to most people.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, small sample size. It's tough. I mean, I don't think that the studies shouldn't be run, but I would rather a collaboration be made and say, hey, let's all get together and get like, one large group over, and maybe in the case of college, 2 semesters long rather than like an 8 week study or something. It is tough. And I do think that sometimes too much weight is put on the studies for sure. I think it can give general recommendations. And also, to be fair, I think the true purveyors of science, the true, like again, like the Dr. Eric Helms and Eric Trexler's, the people who are less sensationalistic, I think they would say that same thing. They would say, hey, look, this is just giving us a general guide, but at the end of the day, you need to use your anecdote, your own personal anecdote and experience and everything. I think it's more the people who are less actual, that people maybe don't have the doctorates or just looking for maybe social media clout, and then take a study and say, this is going to change everything we know about training. I don't see that sensationalism from like the true educators generally.
Yeah, I would definitely tend to agree with that. I mean, I'll be honest, I still don't find that much interest in all that. I just feel like I'm probably going to get more from anecdotal sources. I'd much rather just go to the guy who he's either bigger but not taking steroids, obviously, because that obviously is a complaining factor. But the guy who's very successful, what he's doing, or specifically the guy who is very successful at coaching others, to achieve that end. Like that's where I tend to rather go, or just
Mhm.
personal experimentation. But yeah, you'll notice I never criticize the people that don't do the sensationalism and don't misrepresent findings and all that nonsense. Like you won't find their names mentioned in a negative light on my page.
Yeah.
You mostly find the people like, yeah, I mean, Milo Wolf, Mike Israetel, Minnow, Hanselman's. Good God, that guy's. And I mean, these guys. It's like you don't even have to. You don't even have to get into a critique of science with these guys. You just have to say, okay, what you're posting on Instagram is not even what that study said. That's not, this is not even an accurate representation of the study. Whether or not the study that we're referencing has merit or not, okay, you got to at least represent it in a way that is somewhat responsible, right?
Yeah,
And
sure.
that's kind of that's a fairly low standard, but they routinely fail to clear that bar. So yeah,
Yeah,
that's usually who I take issue with.
I had a buddy who's done a lot of research, and he was published on the cover of Nature, and is in neuroscience. And he always just talks smack on the entire like fitness industry as far as how they do science. And he's like a big fitness bro, but as far as the actual science that comes out of the fitness industry, he's very critical of it. I've had all the guys you mentioned on the podcast, and so these days I don't consume a ton of new content. I don't want to say I don't consume content, but like a lot of it's just stuff that's sent to me. So I'll have to reserve judgment only in the sense that I'm not seeing everything that's posted by, let's say, Menno or Dr. Mike or anything like that. So I believe that stuff probably happens. But I'm not like completely up to date on that. So what I do find interesting is this kind of dichotomy between either it's like got to be science or look at like what somebody looks like, and you obviously have the different camps. You mentioned you try to go by more of like your personal experience and people who are big. I noticed in one or two of the videos I saw of yours, and a lot of the comments were a lot about how the people looked. Saying like, oh, like Milo has impressive legs, for example, but not impressive upper body. So why am I going to listen to him on arms? And I guess this will kind of get into our next discussion a little bit about like, genetic influence and whatnot and weak body parts. But I just find that line of thinking very interesting, especially when it's within the same person. So like, and again, I'm not saying you said this, but like in some of the comments, they were like, why would I take advice from this person being Milo when his arms aren't impressive, right? Why am I going to take bicep growth advice? And implying that they would take, let's say, quad tips from him, which to me is kind of shocking